Welcome back, everybody, to Franchisors.com. Coming to you live from Trevose, Pennsylvania. We're going to be in this office building for a little while today. We have a couple folks here in this office building in particular. Really looking forward to introducing my two next guests here. We have the CEO and the Vice President of Franchise Development, Mr. Todd Leff, and Bob McQuillan here with me today. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Well, I appreciate you guys feeding me breakfast this morning. I had a nice little granola bar. We're on the road quite a bit, waking up early and going to bed late. But this has been really, really fun, and looking forward to talking to you guys as well. I know that we kind of got you guys in the schedule a little bit later, but happy you guys can take some time. Just to kind of first start, I know that this has been a meteoric rise, this Hand & Stone. It really has been. And so, Todd, why don't we start with you and just have you kind of go through, in the early days, what drew you to the business, and, what did you, when you got in here initially, what was one of the first things that you needed to get going from a team perspective? Was it operations? Was it development, marketing? What did you kind of start with here?
All right. Well, welcome. It seems a meteoric rise, but it's actually been 10 years, which it really went fast. And so when I came to Hand & Stone, I had retired, sold interest in previous franchisor to a public company, was looking for a new company to invest in, and John Marco was the founder of Hand & Stone, and did less than 30 days of due diligence, wrote a check, became the CEO, and walked in the first day, and there were 4 employees in the entire company.
Wow!
And so John, the founder, I think my perspective in looking at it was, as long as the underlying business unit worked, we could turn it into a tremendous franchise. But coming in with 4 employees, obviously everybody was wearing a lot of different hats. And so the first thing we really had to focus on is, how do you tell the story of the success of the underlying unit to prospective franchisees? And so the first person I actually looked to hire was a tremendous franchise development person, and that turned out to be Bob McQuillan, who's now been with us for almost 10 years.
Absolutely, and I think that that's a really good transition, because Bob, you were telling me offline that you were actually looking to potentially, be on the franchisee side, and then Todd started getting on your case about coming in on the corporate side, and it worked out the way it did. And obviously you guys have grown really well over the past couple of years, and I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, when you first got in, I'm sure that there were a lot of things that you were trying to figure out in terms of who your profile was and all that stuff. Because how has your selection process changed over the years, and what have you learned from your first wave of franchisees, and kind of how is that different now?
Sure. The franchisees in our system, it's really like no other that I've seen in the industry. They're very sophisticated. I think when we started out, when Todd hired me, and don't let Todd fool you. I mean, he is a CEO, and he's really established a great reputation for building companies, but he's quite the salesperson too, because he convinced me to commute an hour and 45 minutes one way to Toms River, New Jersey every day. But it was a sensational decision, and I have to thank Todd and John Marco for bringing me on board, because the last 10 years it's quite a ride. When I started, we had 28 locations. And today we have over 430 something locations in the U.S. and Canada. And what I've seen from a franchisee standpoint is, when we first started, we certainly had a lot of people that were looking to our industry to become franchisees that could do other things in their life, that could maybe hold a job and become so that awful word that we sometimes use, semi-absentee ownership, which was not part of our model. So our shift was really very different than the industry itself. And I think one of the things that kind of has set us apart is we do not accept semi-absentee owners. So from that standpoint, I've seen kind of a shift in the model that we've developed, number one, and number two, the types of franchisees that we've attracted. There's a reason that we haven't closed a location in years. It's because our people are bought into it, and they work the system every day, and they follow our playbook.
Absolutely.
I think, one of the other shifts too, and I know Bob has been challenged with this, is, emerging franchisors, a lot of times, it's a new concept. Franchisee comes in and says, I'll only do it if I can buy 5 locations, 10 locations, 15 locations. And early on, we allowed some of those larger multi-unit development deals, and I think we found that we could develop much more quickly by limiting the size that we gave out. And so we started to ratchet that down to where, today we won't let anybody, no matter how qualified, buy more than 3 locations at a time. But yet we have franchisees who own 14 locations because they've just continued to come to the table
And they've earned
buy
it too,
up.
right?
That's right. They've earned their way up that chain, and they're learning as they go along. So I think that's one other change in how we've looked at franchisee development.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that's good to note for the folks in the crowd who, are definitely in the early stages of their franchise development efforts. I think that, it's important to not cut yourself off from territories that, may be better served for somebody else just because somebody signs a 10-unit deal that they may never open all of them, right? So
Exactly.
definitely important. So awesome, guys. Thank you. So, kind of going into this differentiation that we began to talk about a little bit, would be helpful for you guys just to kind of let the crowd know how you guys have differentiated yourselves from the other folks in the space, because this space is a very popular one in franchising. So how have you guys kind of set out to differentiate yourselves in addition to what you guys have already talked about on the franchise offering side?
So, in addition, obviously, from a single unit and sometimes 2 to 3 unit deals, and not getting ahead of ourselves with multi-unit contracts, the way we've differentiated ourselves, it's a number of ways. Number one, we have an in-house advertising agency that is just unparalleled in the industry. Todd had brought this concept to Hand and Stone when he came aboard and hired a person to run the marketing end of the business. Since then, we've evolved, and over the course of the last decade, we now have 20 plus employees in HSM, which is our advertising agency. It's really unique. It's a full service agency that only and exclusively works with Hand and Stone franchisees. So their expertise and their knowledge day to day dealing with Hand and Stone franchisees market to market, it is unparalleled, like I said before. But the most unique thing about it is the biggest issue that typically new franchisees have, especially in a retail environment like ours, is when they put their head on the pillow at night, how are they going to drive traffic to their locations? HSM fulfills that need and is quite a differentiator between us and the rest of our competition in the industry as well.
Wow.
I think on the customer facing side, which is the other, you have to differentiate yourself both as a franchisor, but also on the customer facing side.
Yeah, absolutely.
This was always built to be really a day spa experience in a retail environment. And so one of the things, for example, very practical issue, but we put water in all of the rooms from day one. Our competitors did not. And while it was a little more expense up front to build out, that allowed us to do much more services that they were not able to effectively do. And so now, for example, skincare, which did not exist in this model 10 years ago. I brought it in probably 9 years ago. Skincare is now our fastest growing segment of our business and represents over 30% of our revenue. And our competitors are much further behind on the skincare side of the business. And so small practical things that you can do to look to the future of how you're going to differentiate your customer experience are really critical as you start to develop your brand.
Yeah, and that's a recurring thing that people talk about all the time. And we obviously have a lot of smart people on this show, just like you guys, that talk a lot about, having multiple revenue streams for your franchisees and how you shouldn't pigeonhole yourself just to one thing. And I think that certainly sounds like something that you guys have done. Something as simple as just providing water in the room, it makes a huge difference for people. So awesome. So one thing that I've actually heard, I think that Todd, I've actually heard you talk about this at Springboard before, is about unit economics and how important you guys view that as being in your particular business. What do you guys measure when it comes to unit economics? What's important to you guys, and what should people out there that are in their infancy stages in franchising measure in that regard?
I mean, unit economics is the whole game, right? You cannot have a successful franchisor unless the underlying unit makes money, gets an ROI for folks, that people are still willing to invest in the brand and grow more units. That's the whole key. And one of the things we decided early on was that this was going to be the most transparent brand ever. And so we share through technology, through basically a business intelligence platform, every key metric in the business with every franchisee, and that every franchisee can see every other franchisee's key metrics. So we're always, tracking items like, how many prospects are we bringing in per week? What's our conversion to membership? Because a mature location typically gets more than 50% of its revenue from its member base. What's your average ticket? What are we charging the customers? But also down to, and we're measuring employee efficiency, employee attrition rates. So we're sharing a tremendous amount of, kind of economic metrics with franchisees, really to create that competitive spirit among the underlying business units, because nobody wants to be at the bottom of that list, right? Everybody wants to be, in the top 10. And so I think that transparency of sharing those economic metrics is critical.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting thing that not all brands that we've talked to do this, but I think that, a lot of them actually make it publicly available to their franchisees when they're at conference, so to speak, and they're like, look, this is where you're at, and it helps them, that competitive spirit helps them to be better, which I think, honestly, is a really interesting but really effective way to use the numbers you have.
So this is actually a live platform that they see every day. And weekly.
Wow.
So it is a live platform that measures it daily. And I think that goes to one of the keys for emerging franchisors, and I've always said this, is you must have a single POS system, one system of measuring data, of collecting data, and kind of the customer experience.
No matter how painful.
No matter how, and do it from day one, because it's the single most important thing you can do in setting up your franchise.
Yeah, I see my co-host Ryan back there. He has a POS background. He's like nodding his head. He's like, well, thankfully somebody understands me. So it's very funny. So awesome. Well, thank you. So awesome advice there. So to pivot to something, we'll pivot to Bob's world for a second here, and we'll go into franchise sales. A couple recommendations that you may have in terms of, some tools that you use, where you guys get your leads from. I know there isn't a silver bullet with these things, but it's always helpful for people to kind of understand what a mature brand like you guys does.
Yeah. I think, there is a shift from when you do start as a much smaller organization trying to attract franchisees. And for me, I have found, and we've had this conversation, Todd and I and the rest of the management team, that you can't do one thing. There's no silver bullet, right? That we always talk about that if there was a magic bullet, everyone would buy it and use it. So for us, it's building relationships with the consultants and brokers and coaches out there that we've done. So we do draw a lot of attention from those types of networks. We also, from a technology perspective, have invested a great deal in not only public relations, but certainly pay-per-click, SEO. Those are some of the things that are driving this category. Now, when I started 10 years ago, social media wasn't even a conversation that we were having. Now we have a department dedicated to it.
Yeah.
So when I say there's no magic bullet, we've tried it all. And then really focused our energies on what has provided the greatest return on our investments. And we're continuing to do that. I continue to learn in this business every day. It's amazing to me. But for those purposes of, what are you investing in? What would you advise other franchisors? You really have to find your niche and where that investment is getting its return, and then continue to hone your skills in that specific area.
Yeah, measuring it actionably, I think, is the most important thing. And I think that, actually having some data behind it and understanding, well, this works for me, and not just throwing it at a wall and seeing what sticks is important, but having that diversification is important too, right? Like Correct. Not just kind of hanging your hat on one thing, because we often find that some emerging brands, they figure out that one thing works for them, and that's just all they do. And that's not the way to scale, because you got to do a lot of different things to figure it out.
Well, and as you and I know, it was our relationship, over the course of the past year. When we started, I was basically on the phone. It was what we call smiling and dialing. Today we've used FranFunnel with our relationship that developed, and that is just an immediate technology that has an immediate response that you can reach out to the customer within seconds, and so they know. I mean, there's a brand that's going to set themselves apart. So you kind of need to utilize all the tools in the toolbox to do that, and that's been one of them.
No, yeah, and to be honest, for me, and that's going to change, right? I think that just constantly staying on top of the technology that's out there. I mean, communication is going to change. Where you get your leads are going to change.
Sure.
And I think that really the common theme that we see here is that it's important to be nimble. It's important to listen and to not get caught into habits, I think, especially in the franchise space, because, you guys have competitors. People are constantly going to be coming after you. So,
Yeah, sure.
So great. So to pivot to something that I know that you guys are both relatively passionate about, I hope at the very least, is that franchisee-franchisor relationship, and I want to talk about some of the tools that you guys are using to really help maintain that relationship and really to make it flourish as well.
Yeah. So I think it's over communicate with the franchisees.
Yeah.
You must let them know, what's the vision for the brand, what's the culture of the brand, where's the brand headed. And so, we use a number of communication devices. We have a quarterly franchisee webinar for all franchisees where we actually give them all the financial data for the quarter. Obviously, we have a tremendous national convention. We get over 90% attendance at our national convention. And then, we may be a little different. We don't have, and I'm not a great believer, quite frankly, in this kind of politically structured franchise advisory councils.
Mm-hmm.
But what we do have are a number of ad hoc franchisee committees on any important topic related to the franchise. And so, for example, right now we're contemplating a new POS system. We have a franchisee committee made up of franchisees, managers, in-house stakeholders on evaluating POS systems and which one do you bring in. A lot of our development, I'm not sure Bob mentioned, has come through existing franchisees. And so now we have, over 40% of the chain is owned by existing franchisees. So we have an annual multi-unit owner summit where we bring all those multi-unit owners in-house. We just concluded that. So we try to focus the relationship communication issues on specific topics as opposed to creating kind of this, political governmental structure for a franchisee advisory council. We find it gets a lot more different people involved instead of this entrenched old guard who always seem to be at the top of the franchisee advisory council.
Yeah, and it plays a really big role in the culture that you guys have too, right? Because I think that some brands can really do well with the FACs, and they find them to be really helpful. And on the other hand, cross-functional teams, across multiple stakeholders is really important in terms of when you're, I guess, establishing your culture at the very beginning. Was that one of the first things that you thought of? Like you kind of said, I know I don't want to have anything politicized at all.
That was largely from a past experience as a CEO of
Of course, I'm sure.
a very large franchisor who had a very politicized franchisee advisory council.
Mm-hmm.
But we were much smarter. When I came here, there were 26 locations. There were only 15 franchisees.
You got to make the culture.
Right,
That's the best
right.
part.
And so just being able to be, available to those people, to let them have a voice on these committees or through our national convention, I thought was, just a more effective way of keeping that relationship up. They just call us, I mean, if there's an issue, they just call us. They don't have to go through their representative or move it up to the franchisee advisory council. It's still, even at 435 locations, a pretty open door place.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know that you guys obviously have limited time here, so I do want to go to close. There are things that I'm sure that both of you guys, looking back at the very beginning of your time, would probably prefer to have not done. But, I think at the end of the day, it's always helpful to be learning from your mistakes. So is there anything that either of you guys can think of that you think, you guys have learned from, but, you guys did way back when as a mistake that, now is obviously not one anymore?
I certainly think of a number of things that certainly from a franchise sales perspective that we've done, and I think it comes back to decision making and thought processes. When I've looked back at some of the decisions that we've made from a franchise development perspective, I think you need to give yourself time in whatever you're doing. So sometimes the quickest decision, even though something isn't working at that point in time, and I'll give you an example. We had chosen to work with a certain number of PR firms, and I know this is something that a lot of our not only our competitors but people in the industry do. And I think Todd and I have talked about this. Pulling the plug a little bit too early on some of the, some of those relationships might not have been the best decision. Maybe I thought it was at the time. Looking back, I think, older, wiser now, more experience. I think I probably would have stayed with that type of decision for a longer period of time. So I guess my message would be, certainly to emerging franchisors, if it's not working immediately, give it a chance, because it does. You don't necessarily have to make a quick decision in this business, because typically I've found that the longer you stay with it, the more you hone your skills with that relationship, and it ends up working out a little bit better.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would just say from my perspective, the only one is kind of staying one step ahead of the technology curve, and I think we are doing a much better job now. We brought in a new functional head of technology, but having the foresight to see the changes in the consumer behavior, for example, wanting to book appointments, only through the internet, not wanting to call the spas anymore. And we should have been ahead of that. And we now have it in, and we were the first in the industry, but I think we could have done that a year or two earlier.
Sure.
Being ahead of the change in the POS technology. So I think that's a one area, and I think hopefully we've addressed it for the future. But as you're growing really fast, you have to make sure somebody's thinking about what's the next stage in the technology development.
Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for the time. I appreciate you guys fitting us in. Looking forward to seeing you guys soon, and seeing you guys at Springboard next month.
Thank you.
Guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Appreciate
Cheers.
it.